Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And we're in the forward shop, Alasdair.
That we are.
And this is Alasdair Stirling, one of our compatriots here in the forward shop. Where we discuss things in this strange form of debating chamber. And just the four basic questions, Alasdair. So we've already gone over who you are. What is it you do in town?
I run a local business.
And previous to doing that?
I've worked abroad. I worked in investment banking in Far East and venture capital. I've run companies and venture capital companies in Far East.
Singapore, Hong Kong?
Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, yes.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah. And do you think Scotland should be an independent country?
That I do.
Okay. And how best can we achieve that?
That's a difficult question, because the unionists have been extremely successful recently. We've seen a transformation from the referendum in 2014 from being quite an appeasing form of unionism, where devolution was, as it were, a mechanism whereby they would buy off nationalism. George Robertson's famous quote about devolution killing off nationalism, or killing off independence, was a function of that. It was driven really from about '69, the Kilbannon Commission that Heath set up. That whole tenor of unionism was the militant, strident unionism of the past was toned down. Devolution was away. It was a kind of re-envisaged home rule. Ireland had taught them a lesson in the 20s, and they weren't going to go through this again. However, the referendum in 2014 was a living example of the fact that it had failed. And the black-hearted unionist Alan Crochan and his crew are now back in charge of unionism. People like Ruth Davison, Murdo Fraser and Adam Tompkins are clearly hardline unionists, and they have got no intention of surrendering the past, and no intention of letting devolution morph into some form of quasi-independence under any circumstances. And that is a fundamental change in the way that unionism has done its business. Hitherto, the SNP could always make a credible case that devolution, albeit not a preference to independence, was a mechanism whereby we get there. It was
slow and steady in that case.
Yeah, it's death by a thousand cuts is death nonetheless.
Yes.
Independence one power at a time. And that was conceivable because when the first phase of devolution or really what happened when devolution came about, the previous administrative devolution that had been devolved to the Scotland office. Hitherto, prior to devolution, of course, you had the Scottish Grand Committee, which was a kind of pocket parliament inside Westminster, and you had the Scottish Office Ministers, which was a kind of pocket government inside. That's what was devolved, almost lock, stock and barrel in 1999. Mm-hmm. And what that gave is it gave Scotland discrete powers. You had a series of discrete policy areas, things like health, education. Much of the previous Scottish office powers had been taken away and granted to Europe previously, but what remained went to Scotland is discrete policy areas. And what that's allowed us to do, with first of all Henry McLeish with free personal care, and then later on Alex Salmond with his policies around tuition fees, etc., is to envisage a Scottish way of doing things. Mm-hmm. Devolution was never really intended to do that. Devolution was always intended to do two things. First of all, it was allowing to allow Scotland to put a kilt on in English policy.
Okay.
And then the other thing was to give legislative time for things like things that would never see the light of day in Westminster's busy schedule. So good examples are
the day job.
Well, yeah, the good examples are, for instance, tuition fees. Mm-hmm. They were called tuition fees, and they were done one way in England. They became the graduate endowment when the Labour and Liberal administration got hold of it. A kilt was put on the English policy, to all intents and purposes. A good example of the other type are things like the road equivalent tariff. It would never have seen the light of day in Westminster.
Yeah.
And it's a very good thing. And that's what they always envisaged unionism, always envisaged devolution to be. The idea that devolution was going to be a mechanism whereby we could craft a different vision for Scotland, a separate one, different from that of England, was never. Tony Blair was aghast apparently when when he was told that Scotland was going to have free personal care. He just couldn't conceive of the idea.
How dare they?
How dare they? It wasn't what it was all about. It was about putting a kilt on an English policy, quite literally. And they've learnt lessons there. They've learnt not to devolve powers discreetly. They now devolve powers piecemeal. A part of the power here, a part of the power there. A little bit of taxation power, a little bit of benefit power. What that means, and interestingly, far from now being able to use devolution as a vehicle to, as it were, make Scotland independence ready, it binds us into the Union ever more closely, because the only way to create now a rational policy for health, or not for benefits or for tax, etc., is to work closely with England, to work closely with London. Without being able to work closely with London, you don't have enough powers to make discrete policy.
Okay, so how do we unravel that Gordian knot?
Well,
then?
I'll come to that in a minute. I had planned to
Okay.
But the point of the exercise is that what I'm trying to say is that devolution has fundamentally changed. The old idea that we would somehow be able to just get de facto, if not de jure, independence by process of...
Can you explain those legal terms?
Well, de facto means in fact, if not in law. De jure means in law. So a de facto independence was the idea that we would just garner so many progressive phases of devolution would garner so many powers that we would, to all intents and purposes, be independent. And de jure would be the moment when we said, well, we're so close, let's have a referendum where we're independent. But that process is gone. That avenue, that route to independence, insofar as it ever existed, they know very well now. And yes, it's a matter of cooperation between London and Edinburgh, so London also has to cooperate to Edinburgh, there's no doubt on that. But you only have to ask who's the dog and who's the tail. And the answer is London's the dog, and the tail does not wag the dog in this circumstance. We will, in effect, it is a mechanism. This new form of devolution is a mechanism to re-establish unionist control over policy in Scotland, and to maintain it, as it were. And so the SNP finds one of the great sort of fights of the late 80s, early 90s was about the notion of gradualism, and one of the ways gradualism was sold to the SNP was that it was actually a route to independence. Don't worry. Now, what we think about that tussle in days of old is neither here nor there. It existed, it happened, and there is a large part of the SNP who are sold on the idea that devolution is a mechanism, a route to de facto independence.
It's a long process.
It's a very long process, there's no doubt. It's a very long process. But you know, so what? It's death by a thousand cuts. It may take a little longer. It may take decades rather than a discrete snaps fingers referendum. Here it happens. But at the end of the day, it has many. The policy has many attractions. The question is, can it now be judged to be a viable policy? And it's difficult to see that it is.
I think since 2014, I don't think it's a viable policy anymore.
No.
There's a biblical concept of hope deferred makes the heart sick.
Yes.
And it feels that we're deferring hope, or deferring that eventual day further and further into the future. And it could be one of the reasons why so many people have kind of fallen away from being active within the campaign.
Yeah, that plus the fact that the other thing that's happening in unionism, which is a radical change, right back to the Kilbannon Commission in '69, the implicit idea, really all the way back to the Union in 1707, the idea was that Scotland voluntarily joined the Union. And could okay, but the point of the exercise. I'm not saying the rights and wrongs of this argument. Merely, this is what the Unionists said, and that if it wished to leave, it could. All that was required was that the SNP or whichever independence party there might be garner sufficient democratic support through an election that they could do it. Of course, they said this in the expectation that nobody would ever be able to garner that support.
Very famous quote by Thatcher.
Yes, that's right. The Thatcher's saying if they get a majority of MPs, that's that.
Yes.
And whatever the merits, whether they would ever have done that is another question. But there's no doubt that when Alex Salmond was presented a majority government and had put had put a commitment into the manifesto, that Cameron, perhaps only because he thought he was going to win hands down, but nonetheless, de facto he did actually grant the referendum, and he said he would, agree to it. Well, perhaps he wouldn't have done, but that's counterfactual. We'll never know now as to whether he meant. But let's assume, given the benefit of the doubt, that he would have done. But the current incarnation of this referendum, when Nicola asked for a referendum in early 2017, in spring of 2017, the dogs in the street knew that there was a good chance that Theresa was going to say no, and her choice of words, her phrasing, is very interesting, because she doesn't say no. She doesn't say no, never. She says now is not the time. And in doing that, she attacks one of the fundamental bases of what was effectively a convention in the British Constitution. That is, that if Scotland, through democracy, demands to leave or to ask itself that question, it would be granted. There was no question. The English wouldn't, London wouldn't stand in its way. She's now saying Scotland can ask any time it wants. It can say whatever it wants, whenever it wants. The only people who make the decision whether you make that decision is us. Now that's a fundamental change.
It certainly is. Yes.
In the British Constitution that nobody seems to be picking up. Nobody in the nationalist side is actually saying, hang on a second, you've got no damn right to do this. It's being accepted without question. Now we can't guarantee, it's not in our, it's not, but we own this Constitution as much as the English do, like it or not. And the fact of the matter is that if London turns round and says we're changing the Constitution, like it or lump it, and the Convention is part of the Constitution, then do we just accept this without question, without word, without matter? Anyway, that's a matter for another.
Well, there's Nicola was also saying that it's the Scottish people that would bring this forth.
I'll come to the sovereignty of people in a minute,
well,
because it's an interesting question.
Yes, it is. Yes.
But the point about it is whether Nicola should, whether the SNP or the Scottish Government should say anything or shouldn't say, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is that we find ourselves toward going into the late summer, early autumn of 2017 with no viable or plausible route to independence. There is neither the prolonged step-by-step progressive devolution will get us there in the end, de facto if not de jure, what is often called the New Zealand solution, the New Zealand way. And there's no viable democratic way in which we can demand an independence referendum. Because Theresa has made it clear, when she says now is not the time, she says when the time is. Not us, not Scotland, not the people of Scotland, but Theresa May or whoever replaces her in her job. And that again is a fundamental change to the Constitution of Great Britain, because it was always understood. Thatcher, everyone, Major Thatcher, them all said, if you want to leave, you can. And so they test it. And if you put Ruth Davidson's or Theresa's theory to the test, if people really don't want it, well, okay, let Nicola have a referendum. She'll be beaten if they're right. Well, hands down, she'll be beaten, and sooner or later, the people of Scotland will get tired of voting for successive referenda which they continue to answer no to.
Well, there is the argument that there wasn't even the first referendum.
There is, but there was really a referendum.
Well, it was kind of us down here in Dunoon that kind of really, especially Andy Anderson, exposed that aspect of the deeper state involvement.
Again, it is an argument. I've never bought into it, but nevertheless, it's an argument of historic proportions, because ultimately we're in a situation of what do we do now? We face a situation where we don't have either a plausible route to independence through a referendum or a plausible route to independence through progressive devolution. Neither of those two things have happened. We are facing a robust unionism, a unionism that you have to be over 50 to remember this unionism. You have to be older than 50 years old to remember what this unionism looks like. Because if you're not, you've only ever grown up with the rather appeasing devolutionist unionism.
Mm-hmm.
These people like Murdo Fraser, Adam Tompkins and Ruth Davison, they're hardline unionists. You break them open like a stick of rock, they're red, white and blue all the way through.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the reason this is important is because at the moment this unionism is hard, but it's brittle. One sharp blow and we will break it. But if we give them time to temper this unionism, it will be almost impossible for us to win. We must strike now.
Now that's a strong statement, Alasdair, and if you're arguing that there's no democratic process or route to independence, or your second avenue, which is where we actually ask for it through Theresa May, and she says no, what are you essentially arguing here?
I'm saying,
is there a third way or a fourth way?
I'm saying that is what we have to explore, because at the moment, if we hang our hats, our aspirations on the notion that we can somehow devolve our way to independence, albeit that takes longer, or we can somehow garner through some goodwill gesture on their part, on the part of London, that they will grant us, then the game's over. Because we are surrendering excuse me, we are surrendering the control of the fight day one. So the question is, what can you do?
Okay.
And that is the controversial stuff, because having been forced beyond democracy, and let us be very clear, very clear, we
do you think we've actually reached that point?
Absolutely. We take the road not because we wished to, or because we were frustrated at the democratic result. We take the road because we are denied the opportunity through democracy to effect our ambitions. And we must be very clear on whose shoulders this change rests.
Okay.
And it ain't ours.
Then
we are forced to this.
You think the state is actually has created this situation to force our hand in this process?
That's
almost?
Exactly what's happened. But also we must make clear at the same time, we will be happy to go back to democracy at any time. If they choose to allow democracy, if they choose to once again embrace democracy, if they choose to fulfil their democratic.
Yes.
If they choose to fulfil their end of the democratic bargain.
Now you've made a leap there. You've made a strong leap there in saying that this has been, formulated and imposed on by the state. What is your? I mean, I can understand the process of how you explain it, but you're now taking it a step deeper. Where's your justification for this? How do you see this happening, and where?
In what?
I mean, that they've removed the democratic process.
Well, because if they won't grant devolution in terms of powers that we can exercise discreetly,
okay,
then there is no route to independence there. Now that's a choice that they've made. They've chosen. They could have, with the Smith Commission and with the earlier Calman Commission, chosen to grant discrete policy powers, devolve discrete policy areas, but they've not chosen to do that. They've chosen to do piecemeal, integrated devolution, as you might call it. So
right.
We get a little of the power, but not all of it.
And
not
hence
enough.
the cry from the national press that you've got tax powers, why don't you use them?
Yeah, absolutely. But the whole point is we can use them. Of course we can.
Yes, we can.
But only in order to modify
yes.
or alter an existing unionist policy.
Yes.
Or frankly, an existing English policy. Yes, we can put a kilt on that policy, but what we cannot do is envisage a whole new policy. We cannot, realistically, with benefits and tax, we cannot do what we did with education and take a totally different road. or with health, with free personal care. We can't do that because we are tied into their policy decisions in an intimate way.
Okay.
And
Okay.
in terms of the question of shutting down a referendum, unless Theresa is, I mean, the evidence for that is just what they're saying and doing. The fact of the matter is, when she says now is not the time, that's not in her gift. The convention was always been that when Scotland asked, Scotland got.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been politically unwise for Nicola to do that, but that's not the point. It's not. The convention doesn't say what's wise or unwise, or the convention never said. Thatcher didn't say it's unwise for them to do that, but if they do, then we'll.
And no one has addressed this issue with Theresa, and
Nobody's addressed it. There's no question. Nobody's raising the question of the democratic deficit. The SNP and the Nicola have just put their hands up to it and said, okay.
all right.
And there's a retreat to, well, they'll just give us one, but they're quite clear they're not going to do so.
I think so too. So you're proposing a third way in this process?
Well, the point about it is, I look back to other movements who have prevailed, and where we are today is we have to take some form of action that provokes a response. And the response that they may have, or one of the responses that they can have, that the Unionists in London can have, is to embrace democracy once again.
Okay.
That is their option.
Right.
They may choose not to do that, but it is an option. There must always be an option. This whole policy, this whole thing that I'm about to suggest, is underpinned by the fact that at any moment they can unwind it by simply saying, yes, we embrace democracy.
So you're holding on to a higher authority on this, which is democracy, the democratic process itself.
Yes. If you deny us democracy,
yes, then we
may have to, in order to achieve our legitimate aims, we will have to step beyond democracy, or beyond the
to
strict
come back
bounds of
into
law.
lane again.
But at any moment, what we're trying to do, let's be clear, we're trying to provoke a response.
Okay.
It's all about provoking a response.
Okay.
And the response, one of the responses that they may have, perhaps not the only one, and I'll come to that in a minute as well, but one of the responses that they may have is to say, okay, we embrace democracy again. That must always, from our point of view, must be always, two things we must always do. When I'm just about to outlay the sort of thing I'm
you
talking
see
about.
my cogs turning here? Okay.
Yes, I do. But the point I stress now that, one, we are put to it because they forced us.
Okay.
By denying us democracy.
Now that would have to be strongly justified in any future action that you're proposing.
Well,
and
Nicola
clearly stated.
Nicola has asked for a referendum.
Yes.
And been told no, or now is not the time.
And hope deferred makes the heart sick. Yeah.
Not even that. But when is the time? Nobody's telling us when is the time.
Let's get practical. Yeah, exactly.
To be fair, if Theresa came out and said, no, look, actually, we can't do it this time, in September 2018, but there should be a window at March 2019. Well, we couldn't argue with that, to be honest with you. We can't actually argue with that.
That's good and close, yeah.
But we can't argue with that. If that happens to how they go, that's fine, but that's not what she's saying. She's determinedly silent on when might the time be.
Right.
And we are determinedly not asking the question. So what can we do?
Okay.
The answer is it's a slightly longer term strategy than just a referendum 20 years. So they still have time to do this. But what we do is we challenge the very foundations of union. We claim the sovereignty of Scotland.
Okay.
If it's to be more than a meaningless phrase, what it means is that London exercises power not because of some authority or right on its part, but because we grant power to them. And they exercise it only for so long as we suffer them to do so.
Okay, now, didn't the English courts just go through a whole process about figuring out who has actually the power and sovereignty within?
I don't care.
Oh, you don't care?
You're quite right.
Yes.
Of course they did. Of course they did.
And Parliament has the sovereignty to do so.
Under Dicey, of course, Parliament is sovereign.
So,
there's no question.
So now we make a counterclaim.
No, we don't make a counterclaim.
We make a statement.
We don't make a statement either.
Okay.
We just do it. We just do it.
We just do it.
Absolutely.
And Who is their ultimate authority in this?
Well, the ultimate authority is the democratic mandate by the Scottish people.
Okay.
So come the next election in 2014 or 2021, let's assume it's 2021. Come the next election, the SNP, and really we want to have across the independent supporting parties a common constitutional offering. A common constitutional offering where yes, the Greens or whoever can differ on environmental policy or whatever it might, tax policy with the SNP, but in terms of the constitution, there's a single offering at a fundamental level.
Okay.
So here's the question: what do? We put in to the manifesto the claim to exercise some resolved power. We don't have to do many. We don't have to do lots. We only have to establish the precedent. And the precedent is if the people of Scotland back, through a democratic mandate, back the people, the Scottish government exercising, for argument's sake, say financial regulation.
Okay.
Just for argument's sake.
All right.
The Scottish government then sets up a financial regulatory authority on 2021. And they set up their own stock market and debt markets.
Central bank?
Central bank, if you want, yeah.
Bank of last resort?
Yep, whole thing.
Okay.
Take the power away from London. What we're doing is challenging the very foundations, the very, very foundations of union by virtue of destroying their writ. If their writ no longer runs where we say it doesn't run.
Right.
Now, what are they going to do? What are they going to do at this point? Are they going to send in the troops to shut down our nascent...
Not immediately.
Well, are they ever going to send the troops in? Because it's a big escalation on their part if they do that.
Yes, it certainly is, yeah.
It's a huge escalation. So they're probably not going to do that.
But there is precedents for that.
Well, there of course there are. There are loads of them.
Yeah.
But the question is, what are they going to do? But remember, it doesn't really matter. What we're attempting to do is provoke a response. Now, that response could be, yes, to hell with this. If you want, you have to have a referendum. We'll have a referendum. 2, it could be send in the troops and bar the doors. It could be that. 3, it could be just ignore it and let the Scots claim sovereignty as and when they feel inclined. But one way or the other, I guarantee you, doing that will provoke a response. Now, there are some areas of policy, reserved areas, that we cannot realistically challenge. For us to set up a benefit system in Scotland that relies on transfers of money from England
yeah.
or from London,
yeah, exactly,
would simply provoke them to say no money. You know, unless you do what we say, there'll be no money. Now, on the basis of there being no money, then they can effectively defeat the policy just by denying money. So we pick policy areas in where there is no requirement or that we can fund ourselves. A good example would be things like financial regulation. So what are they going to do? They could, of course, take us to court.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Which court?
Well, that's a good question. That is a very good question. If it sees the inside of a court, fine. Let them take us to court and destroy and defeat the mandate of the Scottish people. Let them. Now, let us be clear. Remember, we're not. Okay. Let us again keep an eye on victory. What does victory look like? Victory is the fact that we provoke a response. We force them to response. Whether that response be positive or negative, it doesn't really matter. We'll have to deal with what balls they throw at us.
Right.
But at the end of the day, we're trying to provoke a response.
Okay, but it all hinges upon the democratic mandate of the Scottish people.
Absolutely.
If we don't have that?
Well, in that case, you can't do it. If you believe in the sovereignty of Scotland,
yes, well,
and the sovereignty of the Scottish people, if you cannot garner their approval, then
what we're doing it for?
We're not. I mean, it's a non-starter.
Yeah,
it's not. We're not trying to impose our will against the majority of the people. we will only act on the basis of the will of the people.
Now, when countries have gone for independence before, I'm just kind of trying to clarify what you're thinking here. And one prime example of that would be India. And I think the British state just couldn't let India go without actually putting a spanner in their works, and part of that was the use of segregation, not segregation, sectarianism, where they set the Hindus and the Muslims.
I'm not sure you can really blame the British for that. They may have made it worse, but they didn't start it.
No, they didn't start it. No, the divisions were there.
The divisions were there.
Yeah, and it's historically, we can go through the whole Catholic Protestant thing here that exists in the UK, which is what worries me about that process, with the Conservatives now linking in with the DUP.
Absolutely.
The rise of the rise of the far right in the States, the way that has been kind of manufactured through the press, and
absolutely, of course, but we're there to provoke a response.
Right. Now, but we're hoping,
as long as our response, our actions, are first of all underwritten by a democratic mandate, and are not in any sense violent or whatever.
So this is the key aspects of this are non-violence.
No, of course, there's no violence involved. We're not about blowing bombs in bridges or anything like that. Nothing like that. This is use the law. The law is our sword and our shield.
Okay. Democracy
is our sword and our shield in this.
Right.
And we, with a democratic mandate to do X. Now, would the Scottish people vote en masse to set up a new financial regulatory authority? Probably not. No, but there are things that you can pick. Well, there are policy areas, because remember, we're just trying to set the precedent. Let them defend their precedent or not.
Now, this is taking it up a stage. It's not just demonstrating in the streets. It's not just
calling
an election.
Waste of time.
This is a stronger response directly aimed at the democratic process. Yes, okay.
It's actually governmental disobedience, but it is. It's civil disobedience. And the purpose of that is to provoke a response by London. And the response, as long as the response can always be, one of the things that they can do is embrace democracy. Okay, now we're looking at the Scottish Government to actually move through this process. It has to be done by the Scottish Government. Okay, so who in power in the Scottish Government is actually going to be able to do that? Well, or lead this process? That's another question, and you take it into a question of the SNP and leadership, and it's not something at this thing I think we should cover in this particular thing. That's another discussion, because the key issue is whether there is a support. I mean, I'm not one who believes that the leadership can shepherd us to independence. The government leadership, the SNP leadership, the Green leadership, whoever can stand behind us and tell us we're there. They have to lead us, but the point of the exercise is that we have to be willing to be led, and we have to be clear. There's an interesting question. If you look at the it's fall, an interesting dynamic. It is, but it's this. If you look at the fall of Singapore, Percival, who's the general there, was a run-of-the-mill general, not too bad, not too good, but his troops wouldn't fight. They just weren't. They'd grown up on the pacifism of the 30s, and they weren't much interested in fighting. You know, they just didn't have the heart for it. So who is to blame? Is it Percival for being a poorish general, or the troops because they just weren't prepared to fight for anything? Okay, it's an interesting analogy, but where are you going with it? Well, I'm not going anywhere with it beyond the question you're kind of asking, and that is, who's going to lead us? Who's going to lead this fight? The answer to the question is, at the moment, the current leadership are... You've got to remember, the current leadership cut their teeth on devolution. Yes, they did. They cut their teeth in the devolution fight. There's a famous photograph, I don't know if it's here, but there's a famous photograph of 4 young activists standing at the head of Dunoon Pier. Mike Russell, Alex Salmond. No, it wasn't. That was the other one. Nicola Sturgeon. Yes. Ellie Whiteford, Angus Robertson, and Fiona Hislop. Yes. And they were in the vanguard of the late night fights and arguments at conference over whether independence, fundamental independence or devolution. They are heart and soul devolution. Now, I don't question their bona fides at all. I accept that their argument is it's a mechanism to independence. We would never have got a referendum without devolution. I get that. And if truth be told, I would probably have supported it with them at the time. I question not their bona fides in any sense at all. Merely the fact that time has moved on, and devolution, the devolution that they committed themselves to in their youth, is no longer a viable route to independence. And the question I sense you're asking, we shouldn't get too pejorative about it, but the question is, can the current leadership lead what will be a radically different campaign?
Yes. Radically
different. And that is a matter which I have much indecision about.
Okay.
Well, I actually don't have much indecision. The truth is, I don't think that the current leadership have even the willingness to investigate this. The point of this discussion and discussions like it is to say, look, you have to think a different way. You have to do differently. Are we at the point where we say, as Cromwell said to the English Parliament, you've sat too long for any good you're about to do. Depart, I say, in the name of God, go and let us have done with you. We're close.
You actually think that?
I think we're close to the extent that many of us. I went to Nicola's big rally in 2014 after the referendum in the Glasgow in the SEC, and the hope was that she would, as it were, be Bruce to Salmons Wallace.
Yes.
And sadly, she's turned out to be more John Balliol than Robert Bruce.
That's quite strong.
It is strong, but it's true. And if she has the metal in her, then it's time to show it. She's on. The clock is ticking. The Unionists pen article after article about the schism in the SNP, but they have no idea what's happening in the SNP.
No, they don't.
I mean, you're more likely to get a cub reporter from the Jesuit News telling you the skinny on the wee Free Assembly. They've just got no mechanism to find this out, But what people are questioning is whether Nicola should continue to be leader, or what the changes.
We had a strong mandate post after the referendum.
Absolutely.
The number of MPs we actually sent down to London, it was a strong message to connect with the Scottish Parliament has continued in its to have a strong SNP base, and from that over the last 3 years, there hasn't really been any kind of major policy papers produced. There hasn't been any major from the Scottish Government, that is.
No, not at all.
There has been the accusations from the other parties they're only interested in independence, which is the raison d'etre for the SNP. But behind the scenes that we can chew on, we can look at policies on currency, on the banking issue.
None of it.
There's been nothing focused.
No. And the truth is, yes, there are a lot of peripheral organisations,
yes,
the RIC, Commonweal,
yeah,
etc.
yeah.
And no doubt their work is of great importance to at least to the diversity of the debate, if not to the eventual policy. But without the heft of the SNP, without their heft, without their muscle, without their intellectual power of the people, the diverse group of people who make up the SNP, then quite frankly, the Commonweal can produce all the papers they want. They can produce them till their heart's content. They won't make any difference unless and until the SNP lead that process. And of course, it's an interesting byproduct of starting to focus on reserve policies, is that it forces you to develop those very policies. The truth is, with the exception of the white paper, the SNP has done no work on reserve policies since the early 90s. And that's just the fact of the matter. They are content to do this. And then, in a way, the SNP, Nicola's SNP, and to some extent Alex's SNP, but certainly Nicola's SNP, is very redolent of John Redmond's Irish Party at the turn of the century, the last century, in that they are sold up to home rule. They had no ambitions beyond home rule. And whilst certainly the SNP doesn't proclaim itself to be a home rule party, one does wonder whether there's, at the end of the day, the SNP finds itself in a position where it's an independence party without either a route to independence nor policies for the powers that it would achieve on independence. Can it really, in all truth, be an independence party? Or is it like Tony Blair's Labour Party, socialist in only name? Is it an independence party just in the name, just because it's their unique selling point and how they garner votes amongst their traditional supporters? That's a big question, perhaps one for another day.
So you think they're quite comfy with the powers that they have?
I don't think they're comfy with the powers that they have. I think that the party is led by a group of people who cannot see beyond the arguments and the policies and the passions of their youth.
Ah, okay.
And who, having confronting or having to confront this new dynamic, hardline unionism, have no answers. They have no answers at all, and are terribly inclined to abandon the certainties of their youth. It's like the ancient pre-Inca priests worshipping the sun gods because they will send away the Spanish conquistadors. Well, no, they won't. The conquistadors are here to stay, and yes, so is the smallpox, and so is all sorts of things that they bring with them, and so the gold's going to go and the smallpox is going to stay, and that's going to do an awful lot of damage to your society. But no point in praying to the sun god about this. There's zero point in praying to the sun god about all of this. And to some extent, Nicola and her chums are praying to the sun god.
Okay. Well, this has been quite an interesting. I don't even know how long we've been actually listening and discussing this. But will we pause it there, Alistair, and pick this up again at a later date, and go a little bit deeper and look at the actualities of what's going to.
Well, things that might be the things that might be interesting to look at are: is there some way to create a policy forum, whether on the ideas I've just expounded or in something else? But if you accept the basic tenet of what I was saying, that is that they have taken away the two routes to independence, then the failure to embrace the consideration of a new route to independence or a viable route to independence is to accept unionism lock, stock and barrel, however much they may not like it. That actions speak louder than words in this particular context. And the other thing is, we need to look at policies for reserve powers. What would we do? Whether that be in the long term or the short term, we have to look at policies for reserve powers.
Yes.
Policy thinking must start to gravitate into reserve powers, because one of the problems with the white paper is that much of it was infantile thinking.
Magical thinking.
Well, magical thinking, yeah. But it's not that the policies were per se wrong. It is that they hadn't been tested in the heat of debate. Had you put the currency policy out to the floor of conference in the SNP and had it had a couple of years debate, it would have been a much more robust policy that emerged into the white paper. It might have been fundamentally the same policy, but the arguments around it would have been robust,
stronger. And
the answers to the questions, or certainly the knowledge of the questions that the unionists might ask, would be
thoroughly explored,
and the answers prepared for that. Whereas with even if you think that the currency union was the right answer, and it probably was, if the truth be told, the fact of the matter is we had just nebulous arguments. There are good reasons to ask what would, the unionists say you can't have it. Well, why didn't we ask them why we can't have it? How's this going to work? They were keen on asking us the detail. And it's all very well saying the media don't like us. Well, the media don't. They think the whole basis of nationalism is illegitimate.
Yes, and the pound is an internationally traded currency. We can hook to that.
That's not really the question.
It wasn't really question, but no. That wasn't thought through enough.
No, the question. The truth is, if we have another referendum, although I have some reservations about that, but if we do, we will use the currency. We will use much the same argument in the pound. But the way to counter the Unionists, when the new Chancellor, Philip Hammond or whoever it is, says you can't use the pound, we say, well, okay, explain that, please.
Yeah.
Explain
But we
how.
could probably do that now.
Well,
At
yeah,
the time they couldn't.
But we say to them, okay, Scotland has a money supply of roughly £200 billion, of which 3% or £6 billion is notes and coins. Granted, you'll stand behind the notes and coins. What about the rest of the fiat money, all the bank deposits, the loans, etc.? Are you going to disclaim that? Are you just going to suddenly say that's no longer sterling? Because if you do, that's a sovereign default of £194 billion. It's the largest sovereign default in the history of
Banking.
the history of banking, yes. In the history of sovereign debt. There's never been a bigger sovereign default as £194 billion. Now, that is not what Hammond thought. That's not what George Osborne was thinking. And it won't be what Hammond's thinking. But instead of saying, it's our pound, we're as entitled to use it as you, who cares? Ask them the hard questions. Okay, explain to me how you're going to tell your bankers that they're about to take a 10% hit on their sterling assets. Tell me how you're going to tell the international community that any sterling you hold is now 10% worth, it's only worth 90% of what it was when you had it. Tell me how you say to the people in Scotland, well, your loans, your pay is now in the Scottish tap washer, which is worth nothing, but you'll pay your mortgage in sterling. Ha ha ha. Okay, but my obligation to pay is your asset, is your bank's asset, your Bank in London's asset, and your Bank in London has traded that off to a bank in Germany, which has traded it to a bank in New York through derivative instruments. So you tell me how everyone in that chain, tell me how you're going to say to everyone in that chain, take a 10% haircut on your assets. Now they're not going to do that.
No, they're not.
They're not even thinking about doing that. And the other way they could do it is they could say to Scotland, well, we'll buy you out of sterling. Here's £194 billion for the new central bank. But they've no plans to do that either. So the question is not, it's our can we use the pound? It's how the fuck did we get out of the pound? Because it's hard to get out of it. It took Australia, Ireland, New Zealand 50, 60, 70 years to get out of it. And that was before the explosion of personal credit that took place in the 60s and 70s, and indeed now.
And deregulation of the banks.
And deregulation of banks, etc. That's when the proportion of what they call broad money to narrow money was much smaller amount of broad money around. Now it's hard to see how we'll get out of sterling within 100 years without a radical change. Now that's fine. That has its own implications for Scotland and its independence. But it ain't a trump card for them.
No, absolutely not.
If we ask the question right in the correct way. But the only way we'll be able to do that, the only way that we can get that kind of policy dissemination out onto the guys on the doorstep, because with the greatest of respect, the guy who's handed a card and told to go and knock on number 27 Acacia Avenue, he's probably not somebody who knows a great deal about derivative instruments. He probably doesn't understand the nature of fiat currencies, etc. But he can make the argument if he's given simple, easy argument steps to make. He can do it. He can argue tax, he can argue benefits, he can argue currency. They're not stupid people.
No.
They're just not expert at this. But in order to get that policy has to be created, formed by people who are experts, and it has to be disseminated in easy to understand bites all the way down to the man knocking on the door of Acacia Avenue, or the man or woman in that case. Sorry. And that's not happening. That process is not happening.
No.
And there's no good, Nicola, saying go out and campaign for independence when you've got nothing to campaign about. There's nothing to campaign on.
So depending on what happens at this autumn's conference.
Well, the autumn conference is crucial. The autumn conference is absolutely crucial.
And Nicola's speech at this conference, laying out what she's planning to do over the next, especially over Brexit.
No, it's no good laying out plans for Brexit. She must light the fire under this independence.
So Brexit doesn't matter.
Brexit matters, but again, the whole point about the sovereignty of the Scottish people is that we no longer listen to London. London exercises authority over Scotland not by right, not by some constitutional fiat, not by some document crafted in 1707, but because we, the Scottish people, grant the power, and they exercise it only for so long as we suffer them to do it. And if we take it away from them, in either piecemeal or in a referendum, that's our business. And for them to say thank you very much for the pleasures, goodbye. That's the premise. That's the new policy, if there is one. That's what it is, because there is no other.
Okay.
And will that make them angry? Yes, it will. Will they overreact? Almost certainly. But the whole point is to provoke a reaction.
Okay, and with that, Alasdair, I want to thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's an interesting chat, and I'm no doubt we'll have another chat along the same lines pretty soon.
Good.
And I'll see you later.
Thank you.